The crisp autumn air did little to cool the tempers flaring in the Oakwood Estates neighborhood as Karen Fitzgerald stormed across the street, her face flushed with indignation. Her manicured nails gripped a clipboard, knuckles whitening with each determined step. "This is unacceptable," she screeched, zeroing in on the small gathering by the community park. "I specifically instructed no gatherings over 10 people without prior HOA approval." The attendees, a somber mix of family and friends, paused mid-conversation to stare at the irate woman approaching them. At the center stood a young man, his shoulders slumped as he arranged a bouquet of flowers. "Mom, this is a private burial service," he explained calmly. "We're honoring my grandmother. I'm sure you can understand." "Understand?" Karen's shrill voice cut him off. "I understand that you're blatantly disregarding HOA regulations. This is a flagrant violation, and I will not stand for it." The young man, David, opened his mouth to respond, but Karen had already turned on her heel, marching back toward the street. "I'm calling the police. You have 5 minutes to disperse before I have you all arrested for trespassing." David watched, stunned, as Karen furiously punched numbers into her phone. The other attendees exchanged bewildered glances, unsure of how to proceed. This was supposed to be a somber, private affair, not a confrontation with the neighborhood's notorious HOA Karen. As the wail of sirens pierced the air, David felt his heart sink. His grandmother's final wishes were being trampled on by a petty tyrant who couldn't see beyond her own narrow-minded rules. He steeled himself, ready to face the consequences of this unwelcome intrusion. The police arrived in a matter of minutes, 2 officers striding purposefully toward the group. Karen met them with a triumphant smile, clipboard in hand. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," she said, her tone dripping with self-importance. "These people are trespassing on HOA property and violating assembly regulations. Send you to remove them immediately." The officers exchanged a glance, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. "Mom, can you clarify the nature of this gathering?" one of them asked. "It's a private burial service," David interjected, stepping forward. "My grandmother passed away last week, and we're here to lay her to rest. We're not trespassing. This is a public park." Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips pursing in displeasure. "That's irrelevant. The HOA rules clearly state that any gathering over 10 people requires prior approval. This is a blatant violation, and these people need to leave immediately." The officers looked uncomfortable, their gazes shifting between Karen and David. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but a private burial service is generally exempt from those types of regulations. We can't legally intervene in this situation." Karen's face contorted with outrage, her manicured nails digging into the clipboard. "Exempt? Absolutely not. This is my neighborhood, and I demand you enforce the rules." David watched the exchange, a glimmer of hope rising within him. Perhaps the officers would see reason and allow his grandmother's service to continue undisturbed. But just as he dared to relax, Karen's steely gaze landed on him, her expression hardening with determination. "If you won't do your job, then I'll find someone who will," she huffed, pulling out her phone once more. Panic flashed across David's face as Karen began furiously dialing. He had a sinking feeling that she wasn't about to call the neighborhood watch. No, this was something much more serious. "Mom, I really must insist that you allow this private service to continue," one of the officers said, his voice laced with unease. "There's no need to escalate the situation further." But Karen paid him no heed, her attention fixed on the phone as she waited for the call to connect. David watched, his heart racing, as she began speaking in rapid, clipped tones. "Yes, hello. This is Karen Fitzgerald, the HOA president of Oakwood Estates. I'm calling to report a serious violation of our community rules. There's a group of trespassers holding an unsanctioned gathering in the park, and the police are refusing to intervene. I need someone with real authority to come down here and handle this immediately." David's blood ran cold. He had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who Karen was calling, and the thought of that person arriving only filled him with dread. As Karen continued her tirade, the officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to proceed. David could see the internal conflict playing out on their faces. They didn't want to antagonize the irate woman, but they also seemed unwilling to take action against the somber gathering. "This is ridiculous," Karen exclaimed, her voice rising to a shriek. "I'm the HOA president, and I demand you remove these people from my neighborhood immediately. If you don't, I'll have your badges." The officers exchanged a weary glance, their shoulders sagging with resignation. David watched, helpless, as they began to approach the group, their hands resting on their holsters. "I'm very sorry, but we're going to have to ask you all to leave the premises," one of the officers announced, his voice laced with reluctance. "This is a direct order from the HOA president." The attendees stared back at him, their faces a mix of confusion and dismay. David felt a lump rising in his throat as he watched his grandmother's final resting place being desecrated by Karen's petty power play. Just as the officers began to usher the group away, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its engine idling ominously. David's heart sank as the driver's side door opened, and a well-dressed figure stepped out. "What seemed to be the problem here?" a commanding voice inquired. Cutting through the tense silence, Karen's face lit up with triumph as she hurried over to the newcomer, waving her clipboard dramatically. "Thank goodness you're here, Attorney General. These people are trespassing on HOA property and refusing to leave, despite my direct orders." David felt the color drain from his face as he recognized the stern-faced man striding toward them. The Attorney General, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the state, and he was here at his grandmother's burial because of Karen's spiteful interference. As the Attorney General surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable, David steeled himself for the worst. This was not how his grandmother's final goodbye was supposed to go. The Attorney General's gaze swept over the somber gathering, his brow furrowed in contemplation. Karen stood beside him, her clipboard clutched tightly, a smug expression on her face. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their hands still resting on their holsters. David took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was his grandmother's funeral. He couldn't let Karen's petty power play ruin it. Summoning his courage, he stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing the Attorney General directly. "This is a private burial service for my grandmother. We're not trespassing. This is a public park. I'm sure if you could just speak with the officers, they would understand that we're not violating any rules." The Attorney General's eyes narrowed as he studied David, his expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then he turned to the officers. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice low and authoritative. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Well, sir, the HOA president, Ms. Fitzgerald, called us to report a violation of the community's assembly rules. She claims this gathering is unauthorized and that these people are trespassing." The Attorney General nodded, his gaze shifting to Karen. "And what exactly is the nature of this gathering?" Karen straightened her posture, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "It's a private burial service, sir. But the HOA rules clearly state that any gathering over 10 people requires prior approval. These people are in blatant violation of our regulations." The Attorney General's brow furrowed, and for a moment David held his breath, bracing for the worst. But then something unexpected happened. "I see," the Attorney General said, his voice calm and measured. "However, I'm afraid I don't believe a private burial service falls under the purview of your HOA regulations." Karen's face fell, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. But the rules are the rules," she sputtered. "I demand that you enforce them." The Attorney General raised a hand, silencing her. "Ms. Fitzgerald, I understand your desire to maintain order in your community, but this is a matter of human decency. These people are honoring a loved one, and that should take precedence over your HOA rules." David felt a surge of relief wash over him as the Attorney General turned to the officers. "You're free to go. This gathering is not in violation of any laws, and I won't have you disrupting a private funeral." The officers hesitated for a moment, glancing uncertainly at Karen. But then, with a nod, they turned and headed back to their car, leaving the group in the park undisturbed. Karen stood rooted to the spot, her face flushed with outrage. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice shrill. "I'm the HOA president, and I demand that you—" But the Attorney General had already turned his back on her, striding toward David. "My condolences for your loss," he said, his expression softening. "Please continue with your service. I'll make sure you're not disturbed again." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, sir," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. As the Attorney General returned to his car, David watched, a glimmer of hope kindling in his heart. Perhaps, in the end, his grandmother's final farewell wouldn't be ruined by Karen's petty tyranny. With the officers and the Attorney General gone, the somber gathering in the park resumed, the attendees quietly returning to their places. David took a deep, steadying breath, his eyes scanning the faces of his family and friends. Karen, however, remained rooted to the spot, her face flushed with outrage. She glared at the group, her gaze burning with a mixture of fury and disbelief. How did the Attorney General undermine her authority like that? This was her neighborhood, her domain, and she would not stand for such blatant disrespect. Clenching her fists, Karen strode over to David, her expression twisted with undisguised hostility. "This isn't over, you know," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Just because you had the Attorney General on your side this time doesn't mean I'm going to let you waltz all over my HOA rules." David met her gaze evenly, his own expression calm and resolute. "Miss Fitzgerald, this is a private funeral for my grandmother. Your petty rules and regulations have no place here." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits, her lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, we'll see about that. Just wait until the next board meeting. I'll make sure your little stunt today doesn't go unpunished." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. David watched her go, a sense of dread pooling in the pit of his stomach. He had a feeling that this was far from the last he'd seen of the HOA president's wrath. As the funeral service resumed, David found himself struggling to focus. His mind kept drifting back to Karen and her ominous threat. What would she do next? How far would she go to assert her dominance over the neighborhood? The attendees, sensing his unease, tried to offer words of comfort and support. But David found it difficult to find solace in their kind words. All he could think about was the looming specter of Karen's vengeance and the toll it might take on his family's already fragile state. Once the service had concluded, David found himself pulled aside by one of the older attendees, a close friend of his grandmother's. "David, I want you to know that we're all behind you," the man said, his voice low and serious. "Karen Fitzgerald has been a thorn in this neighborhood's side for far too long. If she tries to pull any more of her stunts, we'll be here to support you." David felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, and he nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just hope I can get through this without any more interference from her." As the group began to disperse, David couldn't help but glance back toward the street, half expecting to see Karen, lurking in the shadows. But the neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of the autumn leaves. Still, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the calm before the storm. Karen Fitzgerald was not the type of person to let a perceived slight go unanswered, and he had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. In the days that followed, David found himself on edge, constantly anticipating Karen's next move. The funeral had been a harrowing experience, and he couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread that now permeated his life. True to her word, Karen had wasted no time in making her displeasure known. At the next HOA board meeting, she had launched into a scathing tirade, denouncing David and his family as disruptive elements who had no respect for the community's bylaws. The other board members, many of whom were longtime residents, had listened with a mixture of discomfort and reluctance. They knew all too well the extent of Karen's influence and her penchant for wielding the HOA's rules like a blunt instrument. David, seated in the audience, had felt his heart racing as Karen's venomous words echoed through the room. He desperately wanted to stand up and defend himself, to remind the board of the solemn nature of his grandmother's funeral. But he knew that doing so would only further enrage the HOA president, and he couldn't risk antagonizing her any more than he already had. In the end, the board had decided to take no immediate action, choosing instead to monitor the situation closely. David had left the meeting with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, knowing that Karen would not be satisfied with such a tepid response. As the days passed, David found himself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected noise or unfamiliar vehicle in the neighborhood. He couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And strike she did, in a manner that left David reeling. One morning, as he was preparing to leave for work, he found a notice taped to his front door, a citation from the HOA for unauthorized landscaping modifications. Confused and alarmed, he quickly scanned the document, his blood running cold as he realized the nature of the alleged violation. Apparently, the small flower bed he had planted in his front yard, a gesture to honor his grandmother's memory, was in direct violation of the HOA's strict landscaping guidelines. And for this offense, he was being fined a staggering $500. Fury and disbelief boiled within David as he crumpled the citation in his hand. This was nothing more than a blatant act of retaliation, a petty attempt by Karen to assert her dominance and punish him for daring to defy her. With a trembling hand, David reached for his phone, determined to fight this unjust citation. But as he scrolled through his contacts, his heart sank. The Attorney General's number was nowhere to be found, and in that moment, David realized that he was on his own, facing the full force of Karen's vindictiveness. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. David would need to find a way to stand up to the HOA president, no matter the cost. Karen's reign of terror had to end, and he was determined to be the one to bring her down, fueled by a mixture of anger and determination. David set out to challenge the HOA's citation. He knew that going up against Karen and the HOA board would be an uphill battle, but he refused to back down. His grandmother's memory was at stake, and he wouldn't let her final wishes be trampled on by the neighborhood's self-appointed tyrant. First, David attempted to reason with the HOA directly, reaching out to the board members and pleading his case. He explained the significance of the flower bed, the fact that it was a tribute to his late grandmother, and how it in no way violated the community's landscaping guidelines. But his pleas fell on deaf ears, with the board members either unwilling or too intimidated by Karen to rule in his favor. Undeterred, David decided to take his case to the public. He reached out to local news outlets, hoping to shed light on the HOA's unjust actions and rally the neighborhood to his cause. The story quickly gained traction, with several media outlets picking it up and painting Karen Fitzgerald as a villain of the piece. As the news coverage intensified, David could see a shift in the community's attitude. Neighbors who had previously remained silent now came forward, sharing their own stories of Karen's heavy-handed tactics and her disregard for the well-being of the residents. A groundswell of support for David began to emerge, with people rallying to his defense and condemning the HOA's actions. Karen, of course, was furious. She lashed out at the media, accusing them of sensationalizing the story and painting her in an unfair light. She even went so far as to threaten legal action against any outlets that continued to report on the issue. But the more Karen fought, the more the community rallied behind David. Residents began openly defying the HOA's rules, planting their own memorial gardens and holding unauthorized gatherings in the park. The once docile neighborhood had been transformed into a battleground, with Karen and her supporters on one side and the growing resistance on the other. David, emboldened by the community's support, decided to take his fight to the next level. He reached out to a local civil rights attorney, seeking legal counsel on how to challenge the HOA's citation and perhaps take down Karen's reign of terror once and for all. The attorney, a seasoned veteran in dealing with HOA disputes, listened intently to David's story. She nodded grimly, her expression darkening as she realized the full extent of Karen's abuse of power. "This is a clear case of retaliation and discrimination," the attorney declared. "With the community support and the media attention, we have a strong case to challenge the citation and potentially even dismantle the HOA's unfair practices." David felt a glimmer of hope blossom in his chest. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, he finally had a path forward, a way to honor his grandmother's memory and reclaim his community from the clutches of the notorious HOA Karen. The battle lines had been drawn, and David was more determined than ever to emerge victorious. With the attorney's guidance, David launched a multi-pronged legal offensive against the HOA and Karen Fitzgerald. First, he challenged the citation for the flower bed, arguing that it was a harmless act of memorial and that the HOA's guidelines were being applied in an arbitrary and discriminatory manner. The case quickly gained traction, with the community's outrage fueling a groundswell of support for David. Neighbors testified about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, and the media coverage continued to shine a spotlight on Karen's abuses of power. As the legal battle unfolded, David also set his sights on a more ambitious goal: dismantling the HOA's unfair practices altogether. With the attorney's expertise, he began exploring avenues to restructure the organization, limiting the president's authority and ensuring greater transparency and accountability. The HOA board, led by the increasingly embattled Karen, fought back furiously, deploying a team of high-priced lawyers to defend their turf. But with the community's support and the weight of the evidence against them, their efforts began to crumble. In a pivotal court hearing, the judge ruled in David's favor, declaring the citation against the flowerbed as an act of unlawful retaliation. The HOA was ordered to rescind the fine and issue a public apology, a stinging rebuke that sent shockwaves through the community. Karen, her face flushed with outrage, stormed out of the courtroom, vowing to appeal the decision. But the tide had turned, and her grip on the neighborhood was rapidly slipping. Emboldened by the victory, David and his legal team pressed forward, filing a class action lawsuit against the HOA. The lawsuit alleged a pattern of discriminatory practices, excessive fines, and a general disregard for the rights and well-being of the residents. As the case wound its way through the courts, Karen's allies and the HOA board began to distance themselves, fearful of the growing public backlash. One by one, they resigned, leaving Karen increasingly isolated and without the political capital to maintain her stranglehold on the community. In a final, desperate move, Karen attempted to rally her most ardent supporters, calling for a special HOA meeting to vote on her continued leadership. But when the day arrived, she was met with a sight that shattered her delusions of control. The community hall was packed to the brim with residents, all of them united in their determination to see her reign come to an end. As the vote unfolded, Karen watched in stunned silence as the motion to remove her from office passed with an overwhelming majority. Her dreams of unchallenged power had crumbled, and the aita Karen was finally dethroned. David, standing among the cheering crowd, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His grandmother's memory had been honored, and the community had reclaimed its rightful place. It was a bittersweet victory, but one that filled him with a sense of pride and determination for the future. In the aftermath of Karen's downfall, the Oakwood Estates community breathed a collective sigh of relief. The once oppressive HOA was now under new leadership, with a renewed focus on transparency, community engagement, and fairness. David, the reluctant hero of this saga, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to challenge Karen's authority now sought him out, eager to express their gratitude and apologize for not speaking up sooner. The local media, too, continued to follow the story, hailing David as a symbol of the community's resistance against tyranny. He was invited to speak at civic events, sharing his experiences and inspiring others to stand up for their rights in the face of overzealous HOA rule. As for Karen, she retreated from public life, her dreams of unchallenged power shattered. Some whispered that she had moved away, unable to bear the shame of her downfall, while others claimed she still lurked in the shadows, plotting her comeback. But David and the rest of the community were determined to ensure that her influence never again cast a dark shadow over their neighborhood. The flowerbed that had sparked this entire ordeal remained, a lasting tribute to David's late grandmother. It bloomed with vibrant colors, a testament to the power of community and the resilience of the human spirit. In the end, the HOA Karen saga had taught the residents of Oakwood Estates a valuable lesson: that standing up to injustice, no matter the cost, was the only way to reclaim their rightful place in the community they called home. For David, the experience had been both harrowing and transformative. He had faced down his own fears, rallied his neighbors, and emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for the memory of his beloved grandmother. As he stood in the park, surrounded by the thriving flowerbed, David couldn't help but smile. The future of Oakwood Estates was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The days of HOA Karen were over, and the community was ready to write a new chapter, one of inclusivity, respect, and the freedom to honor the memories of those they loved.